Good morning. It is a pleasure to be here with you today. I just wish I had a better text from which to proclaim since you're here with me. But alas, we have returned to our Command to Preach series, in which members of the congregation submit texts that they would like the clergy to expound on. And it just so happens that I pulled out of the hat Judges 19. The person who submitted that text wants to remain anonymous, not because I think they fear what you would say, but I think they just simply want it to stand out there. They did say, however, this is the one text that makes it hard to read the rest of the Bible. And so, listener discretion is advised as I read from Judges, the book of Judges. In those days, when there was no king in Israel, a certain Levite residing in the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim took to himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. But his concubine became angry with him, and she went away from him to her father's house in Bethlehem in Judah, and was there for some 4 months. Then her husband set out after her to speak tenderly to her and bring her back. He had with him his servant and a couple of donkeys. When he reached her father's house, the girl's father saw him and came with joy to meet him. His father-in-law, the girl's father, made him stay, and he remained with him 3 days. So they ate and drank, and he stayed there. When the man with his concubine and his servant got up to leave, his father-in-law, the girl's father, said to him, "Look, the day has worn on until it's almost evening. Spend the night. See, the day has drawn to a close. Spend the night here and enjoy yourself. Tomorrow you can get up early in the morning for your journey and go home." But the man would not spend the night. He got up and departed and arrived opposite Jebus, which is Jerusalem. He had with him a couple of saddled donkeys, and his concubine was with him. And when they were near Jebus, the day was far spent, and the servant said to his master, "Come now, let us turn aside to this city of the Jebusites and spend the night in it." But his master said to him, "We will not turn aside into a city of foreigners who do not belong to the people of Israel, but we will continue on to Gibeah." So they passed on and went their way, and the sun went down on them near Gibeah, which belongs to Benjamin. They turned aside there to go in and spend the night at Gibeah. He went in and sat down in the open square of the city, but no one took them in to spend the night. Then at evening, an old man coming from his work in the field looked up and saw the wayfarer in the open square of the city and said, "Where are you going, and where do you come from?" The Levite answered him, "We are passing from Bethlehem in Judah to the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim, from which I come. I went to Bethlehem in Judah, and I am going to my home. Nobody has offered to take me in." The old man said, "Peace be to you. I will care for all your wants. Only do not spend the night in the square." So he brought him into his house and fed the donkeys. They washed their feet and ate and drank. While they were enjoying themselves, the men of the city, a perverse lot, surrounded the house and started pounding on the door. They said to the old man, "Master of the house, bring out the man who came into your house so that we may have intercourse with him." And the master of the house, went out to them and said to them, "No, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Since this man is my guest, do not do this vile thing. Here are my virgin daughter and his concubine. Let me bring them out now. Ravish them and do whatever you want to them. But against this man, do no such thing." But the men would not listen to him. So the Levite seized his concubine and put her out to them. And they wantonly raped her and abused her all through the night until the morning. And as the dawn began to break, they let her go. As the morning appeared, the woman came and fell down at the door of the man's house where her master was until it was light. In the morning, her master got up, opened the doors of the house, and when he went out to go on his way, there was his concubine lying at the door of the house with her hands on the threshold. "Get up," the Levite said to her, "we are going." But there was no answer. Then he put her on the donkey, and the man set out for his home. And when he had entered this house, he took a knife, and grasping his concubine, he cut her into 12 pieces, limb by limb, and sent her throughout all the territory of Israel. Then he commanded the men whom he sent, saying, Thus shall you say to all the Israelites, has such a thing ever happened since the day the Israelites came up from the land of Egypt until this day? Consider it, take counsel, and speak out. Will you pray with me? Merciful Lord, speak, your servants are listening. Say a word that we might hear. Penetrate the horror of this text, that revelation may come forth. May it be so. The story before us is a narrative of nihilism. There is no good thing in it. It swings from extreme to extreme. Radical hospitality gives way in the next turn to extreme violence. People and places thought safe and reliable reveal themselves as sources of torture and dehumanizing abuse. A Levite, a priest, is a holy man honored for faithfulness and trusted to instruct others on how to honor covenant with God, but here reveals himself entitled, vengeful, cruel, and violent. At the beginning of the story, he goes to find his concubine, his second wife or secondary wife, to speak tenderly to her, to convince her to return home. One wonders why she left in the first place, given what he eventually does. By the end of the story, to save himself from a violent mob, he sacrifices her to people so removed from the covenant command to offer radical hospitality that the only way they know how to respond to the stranger in their midst is through rape and violation. And as the concubine clings to life after the violent attack upon her, the Levite responds even more cruelly than we can imagine. He throws her on his donkey to return home, takes a knife to dismember her, and sends the 12 parts of her body to all the tribes of Israel to precipitate a civil war. The theologian Phyllis Tribble described this chapter as an extravagance of violence. It is so terrible and violent that this chapter of Judges is not included in the readings of church lectionaries, and rarely do preachers choose it for regular instruction. And when I approached the text, I resisted it. I kept looking away. I kept objecting not just to reading it, but also to its inclusion in the canon. Why was it included? And in a substantive question, how did it come to this? How did God's gift of the promised land become a place of chaos and disorder? How did the leadership of Moses and Joshua become lost to new leaders? According to the writers and composers of the book of Judges, because of Israel's unfamiliarity with God and her failure to abide by the covenant God made with Israel, in those days there was no king. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. And the consequences of this type of self-assertion, the consequences of this refusal to be bound by the terms of covenant with God, to make everything but God their ultimate concern, was corrupt, inconsistent leadership, violent self-assertion, and selfish ambition. And so the whole of Israel, including each of the tribes, descends into anarchy, disorder, violence, and utter breakdown in the social order. There is much fighting, smiting, and infighting, almost all of it committed in the name of God, even as Israel lapses into idolatry and disobedience. And so by the time we get to Judges 19, notwithstanding our celebration of people like Deborah or Samson, by the time we get here, there is nothing left. The story of the Levite and his concubine shows in narrative detail how bad it can get when Israel refuses to be bound to God, to let God be the center, how their mode of existence in loving relationship with God disintegrates when they reject God as their king, and how disappointing it is. How disappointing. There is no leadership, especially like the leadership we saw in Moses and Joshua. There is no accountability. We can't rely on anybody's character because God is no longer the ultimate concern for God's people. And the fight is not just about God's people standing up against foreigners. No, because there is no leadership and the people are determined to do what is right in their own eyes, God's people fight among themselves. The tribes of Israel refuse to provide radical hospitality among themselves and choose the most extreme means to settle disputes or achieve their goals. So rape, murder, civil war all become tools of control, exploitation, and domination. And so in this particular reading, there is no good news here. That's why I fought the text so hard. I condemned it. I expressed my dislike of it to anybody who would listen. Just ask my clergy colleagues and the staff. My every intent was to skim over the ugly details and draw out some other avenue of exploration. But I kept reading. I could not look away. Oh, I started picking up other translations, hoping for an escape route. And like a bolt of lightning, I was slammed back with the startling realization. This text breaks through our tendency to romanticize and spiritualize the biblical world. Oh, I know you want to be, I'm going to say that again, I might get in trouble. But we romanticize and spiritualize the biblical world. All the great biblical heroes are the ones that we want to hold on to. But perhaps this text has to be here for us to read and use for reflection so that we do not delude ourselves that the heroes and the good people of the Bible are above reproach. More than that, it is easy for us to condemn behavior that is so far removed from us because it sits in the pages of ancient writ. It doesn't take much to dissociate ourselves from the violence or the trauma because it's in there. But the truth is that this text highlights that, yes, this is indeed a violent world, but also our world too is just as violent. Before we pat ourselves on the back for our enlightened minds about how we're far removed from such primitive behavior, our capacity to look at this story of war, rape, and abuse of women, of idolatry and violent self-assertion with righteous judgment and indignation, we must face that our world and culture are not innocent of this type of violence. Throughout history, nations and religions have waged violent war with atrocities so terrible that we do not linger long over the details, and we give ourselves room to lie and deny about what has happened. But this text won't make us look away. We must accept that only recently has the book of Judges, and this story in particular, offended our religious sensibilities. In our nation's history, our spiritual forebears used the book of Judges as justification for violent repression and conversion of indigenous people and the theft of their land. The book of Judges was license for our spiritual forebears. And so we must now know the uncomfortable truth that we are no less violent than the world painted in the book of Judges. I know someone will probably object. But the lack of religious, political, corporate, and educational leadership in the modern world has resulted in a paroxysm of violence in every nation and culture and in every age. And the value we have placed on individualism and self-assertion and great ambition, celebrating the success and abundance that these characteristics produce, do not elicit our criticism of the abuse and cruelty and exploitation that accompany it. And the result is a grasping, violent world that doesn't know God or what God has done. All but the realization of the truth of violence in our context, though frustrating my search for good news, does raise the question, what do we do? What do you do with a text like this? Well, out of the mouth of the Levite, I think we find what it is we can do. Out of the mouth of the Levite who so disappoints us is the wisdom I think this text offers. When he used the dismembered body of his wife as a potential summons to violence, he invited the tribes to consider it, take counsel, and speak out. Therein, I think, lies a constructive approach to the violence that offends and distorts the world. The means by which we avoid relying on justifications, escape hatches, and ways to avoid both the violence of this text and the violence of our world. We think about it and then speak out. We confront the violence that is committed in our names and in the name of God, and we speak out about it. Do not let violence be the last word or the only mode of our existence. Do not let the human limbic brain be the only way we move and participate in the world. Do not let violence be the last word. And there is so much for us to think about and speak out about. The deaths of Tamir Rice, George Floyd, Dante Wright, Amir Locke, and so many others call out for thinking more clearly and speaking out about violence. Those wondering where the shouts of Black Lives Matter or Me Too or No One is Illegal come from, it is a way for people to speak out about things that people would rather keep silent. It is the voices of people who have decided to speak out about violence and injustice. We have a lot to speak about. Vulnerable populations, especially communities of color, suffer community violence at the hands of neighbors and state violence at the hands of law enforcement, and much of it on an endless loop of cell phone and body cam footage aired on social media 24/7. It's in our faces. We have to speak about it. Every year, more than 700 people experience threatened, attempted, or completed rape, with 81% of women and 43% of men reporting experiencing some form of harassment or sexual assault or rape in their lifetimes. Think about it. Think about it. Recently, the Center for Disease Control reported that in 2019, firearms were the leading cause of death for American children, teens, and young adults ages 1 to 24. Think about that. Think about that. In the aftermath of the violent attack on the U.S. Capitol last year, a public opinion survey found increasing numbers of respondents endorsing extreme violence as a response to electoral defeat, and agreeing that violence was justified if people feared, quote, losing their country. And there is no looking away from the conclusion of the historian Eric Hobsbawm, who describes the 20th century as the most murderous century in recorded history, with its wars and terrorism causing an estimated 187 million deaths. We live in a violent world. A violent world. Think about it. Speak out about it. Martin Luther King, Mahatma Gandhi, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, to name a few, talked all the time about how violent the world was, inviting us to think about it and then speak out. And so, while there isn't the great good news that we often want to walk away from the Bible with, I think our marching orders are clear. That we have to think about the suffering this kind of violence causes. And we cannot look away. We cannot allow the safety and reliability of the people and places that protect us to deceive us into thinking that all is well with the world. There's nothing that we can do about the violence visited upon others. Think about it, though, and speak out. Speak out for the nameless, speechless women who are raped and abused. Speak out about the murder of our children with firearms. Speak out about war and terrorism, not just when it affects our own nation, but all over the world. Let us be the voices of the suffering. When our culture, when our religion, when our nation ignores or silence or oppress them. Let us never be caught in the moment when there is no king in the land and that all the people do what is right in their own eyes. Speak out. Amen.